Someone smarter than me suggested that maybe I should introduce myself at the start of some of the videos that might go a little bit bigger. Makes sense. I'm Mark Darrah. I'm this guy, the executive producer on Dragon Age Inquisition, which is what we're going to talk about today. So coming off of Dragon Age 2, this is when both myself and Mike Laidlaw actually joined Twitter. I may not have gone into this in enough detail on the Dragon Age 2 video, but I think it's worth talking a little bit about Dragon Age 2's timing before we move on to Inquisition. Dragon Age 2 came out in early 2011, and there's something else that came out in 2011, a little bit later in the year. Something that changed the fantasy RPG landscape for basically 5 years with its launch, and that's Skyrim. So when we talk about Dragon Age 2 and things that could have been done and things that could have been changed, you have to remember that 11/11/11, November 11th, 2011, is basically an unpassable date. If Dragon Age 2 had come out after Skyrim came out, regardless of how much it had been improved or changed, the landscape was just so different in a post-Skyrim world that there's no way that Dragon Age 2 in its basic DNA could have gone up toe-to-toe with Skyrim. So that's the world that we're talking about Inquisition in. Even in the pre-Skyrim launch, we are going to E3 2011 and getting into that initial Skyrim gameplay demo. You can tell even then, even in the mid part of 2011, that this is going to change the world. This is going to change the world of fantasy RPGs. So both Mike and I are now looking at this landscape, recovering from the disappointment that was Dragon Age 2's launch, and looking around and thinking about what we need to do. And we know we need to get exploration back into the franchise because our games have been getting smaller and tighter as time goes by. We need to get that scale back. And Skyrim is going to just dial that up to 11. To do that, we needed a new engine. A common question that is asked of me is, was Frostbite the right choice? And it's usually asked with an expectation that my answer is going to be no. It wasn't the right choice. We should have used Unreal. But here's the reality of that kind of question. When you ask that sort of question, you have to really answer it within the context of the reality of the moment. In 2011, Unreal wasn't on the table. It wasn't an available option for an engine for Dragon Age Inquisition to use. The only real choices at that time would have been to continue to use the engine we'd used for Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2, an internal engine that required a lot of updating in order to accommodate larger areas, better level art creation, and better graphical fidelity, or Frostbite. This is a time period where Patrick Soderlund is incredibly powerful within the EA organization. His star is rising rapidly. The choices are keep using the old crotchety thing you have been using, or use Frostbite. And I'll get behind you if you use Frostbite. The reality is given the world that we lived in 2011, Frostbite was the only choice. Additionally, we'd done some initial preliminary work with Blackfoot, which was an initial Dragon Age exploratory game that was being built on Frostbite, looking at multiplayer and looking at what Frostbite was capable of doing. That game never came out. We absorbed it into the Dragon Age Inquisition team. Given where we were in 2011, the only possible choice was Frostbite. But of course, let's step a little bit further back. If that restriction didn't exist, if Patrick Soderlund wasn't putting essentially a thumb on that scale, was it the right choice? In a completely blank slate world, I guess I would say that no, it probably wasn't. In a world where Dragon Age Inquisition was built on Unreal, then you can start to imagine a world where BioWare is simply an Unreal studio. The Mass Effect line stays on Unreal, Inquisition and then future Dragon Ages are on Unreal, and then Anthem is built on Unreal. It's a very different world. It's easy to imagine, I'd say, an overly rosy version of that future, because it starts to make sense that maybe Inquisition can use some of the work that was done on the Mass Effect trilogy and everything's building on everything else. Given what happened with Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem in Frostbite, I find it actually pretty hard to believe that we would have become a truly convergent studio simply by being Unreal, but maybe you could hope. But this wasn't the world that we were living in, so all of this is basically fantasy. As I said, there were really just two options on the table for this project, and one of them was to continue using the very elderly engine from Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2. So Frostbite was the only thing that we had available to choose. Now, going into Frostbite, the leadership of Dragon Age had watched what had happened with Mass Effect 1 going onto Unreal. Mass Effect 1 had approached Unreal as if it was an internal engine, didn't respect its thoughts about architecture, didn't really choose to engage in that engine on its own terms. So when we're starting up on Frostbite, we're trying to do those things. We're trying to treat Frostbite on its own terms, trying to do things the Frostbite way, trying to cover the things it doesn't do with tools. Dragon Age Inquisition spent 30% of its tech budget on tooling, on building tools to allow it to build the game that ultimately came out. Some of those tools came incredibly late, even post-alpha, even in some cases after we had content locked. And that's not ideal. Ideally, you would have your tools way earlier. But we were going in with a goal towards building tools to respect the engine, to build on top of what was already there, and to lean into what the engine was good at. When we get to Andromeda and Anthem, you'll see that that 30% was not followed by the subsequent games. And to their massive detriment, tools are incredibly important. RPGs are content-driven games, so you need to be respectful of your tools needs in order to have a situation that's actually survivable by your development team. Is Inquisition perfect in this respect? It certainly is not. And we had lots of things come in some cases, too late to really be particularly useful. One note here on Frostbite. Frostbite's really good at making art, especially level art, or at least it was compared to the tools that we were used to coming from Eclipse. But additionally, at least at the start, when we're starting to work with it, it was completely incapable of making anything RPG related. It didn't really understand stats, it didn't understand classes, it didn't understand any of these things. So this discrepancy where the art team was able to get going and start making content right away, and the design team had to wait for systems to come online. In some cases, those systems not coming fully online until after alpha. That discrepancy is something that actually colored and influenced Dragon Age Inquisition throughout its development and affected the game that ultimately resulted. We know we want to get exploration back in the game. We know we're using Frostbite. So now we're starting the process of presenting vision and X statements and all of the things you do to start to align a team around a direction. This was pretty rocky on Dragon Age Inquisition for basically three reasons, I would say. First of all, we were presenting a top level vision, things like Dragon Age with a Skyrim vibe, or the exploration of Dragon Age Origins in Frostbite, or things like that, things that sort of were very surface level. And those kind of statements can be incredibly useful. It's incredibly valuable to be willing to have vision statements or X statements that are somewhat derivative, where you say it's like X with Y, because people can grab onto those things really effectively. But when you're presenting a surface level vision, ideally what you would want to then do is have your sub-disciplines and sub-teams present more detailed visions within their own respective areas that feed back and build upon that overarching vision statement. This is what we were doing on Joplin. This is what we were doing on Morrison as well. Because by doing that, people are able to find something that they understand a little bit better, grab onto that, and then build up towards the overarching vision. If you just have a single top level statement, in a lot of cases, you're going to have to say that statement a lot of times in a lot of different ways to get people on board. And you're going to just have to keep saying it. They say you have to say it 7 times. Often in the case of a vision statement, you need to say it way more than 7 times, and you need to say it in way more than 7 different ways. It took us a long time to figure out how to communicate the vision vision to a team of over 200 people in a way where the majority of people were understanding it and able to get behind it. But this also outlines something that I learned on Dragon Age Inquisition, which is sometimes people are never getting on board. And from those people, unfortunately, what you'll often get is a statement that sounds a lot like, I don't know what the vision is. And because Inquisition spent so long where that was a legitimate concern, because we weren't always being clear enough in terms of what our vision is, it took us a long time to figure out that actually in the later stages, when someone says, I don't know what the vision is, what they're actually saying is, I don't like the vision, and I am going to be confused by it because I don't want it to work. I don't want to get behind this vision because you haven't convinced me that I should. And part of that is your job to be convincing, to be complete, to provide as much detail as you can. But at some point, you need to take some of these people aside and basically say, you do know what the vision is. You either need to get behind it or we need to get you off the team. Beyond a certain point, people need to align behind the direction. And they don't have to necessarily like it, but they have to be willing to go along with it. And that took us a long time to realize that some of our loudest voices of confusion were actually the voices of dissension, disguising themselves as voices of confusion. So one last thing on vision. I actually don't remember the specific language we were using in the early days of Dragon Age Inquisition for its vision, which isn't a great sign. I can remember the vision statement for Mass Effect 2, which was the Dirty Dozen in space. I can remember the vision statement for Joplin, which it was, we would be heroes, but the records are sealed. But I don't remember the exact language we were using for Dragon Age Inquisition. I think this is largely because as a story shaper, I was building this vision in the interaction with the team. And as a result, there was never super duper crisp language that came out of that. Instead, there was a lot of personal visions that were tailored to the audience time after time. That's fine when it comes to getting buy-in from the team, but it meant two things. It meant, first of all, you had to do this for each new person you added to the team because there wasn't a super evocative single statement that you could use to begin the process of integrating a new team member. And additionally, it also meant that outside of the team, within the rest of the BioWare and EA organization, you didn't have something that would start and end the conversation. When you only had 30 seconds, it was harder to pitch what Dragon Age Inquisition was to that audience. Now, as we moved further on, it became a lot easier to do this, and those visions did arise. But in those early days, we did spend a lot of time having difficulty explaining and selling the project through its vision statement. So having that crisp language that you can use to present vision in a sentence or maybe two is incredibly important. It doesn't get the whole job done, but it starts the job so much more easily. And this applies to your overarching vision for the entire project, but also those subvisions that you're having your teams develop within the greater project. Now, I promise we're almost done with vision, but two little stories. If you are having difficulty presenting the vision of your project, if you are having difficulty communicating exactly what the project is, then you can get into a situation where the feedback and questions you're getting from the executive are missing the target so badly that you can get into what I'm going to call the no's. And what I mean by that is you're presenting your game to an executive team and they're going to ask a series of questions about the project. And let's use Dragon Age Inquisition as an example, and these are real questions that happened at various points in time on Dragon Age Inquisition. Can I chop down a tree? Can I ride a dragon? Those questions are coming from a mistargeting of their understanding of the project. They're understanding that it's open world and they're pattern matching it to other games they might have played or other things they might imagine. They don't understand your game game well enough to ask the right questions. If you're in the nose, then that means you have a big problem, because constantly having to tell an executive that no, your game doesn't do the thing they just asked about, and never really being able to say yes, is a big problem, because it saps the enthusiasm out of them, and it saps support along with that enthusiasm. So if you find yourself in the nose, you need to start clarifying your project. What we found as we got deeper into Inquisition in the last 18 months or so was that the questions were much better. And as a result, you could answer them with yes. Can I play a wizard? Can I romance a follower? Can I romance this follower? Do I get to change Skyhold? Are there different mounts? Not always every single question is going to have a yes answer, but what's going to happen is as you get more and more alignment, you're going to get more and more yeses. So the lesson there is use the fact that you're in the nose as a huge red flag that you are failing to communicate what your project is to the people that you're interacting with. Sometimes the only way to get that understanding is to get the game more done so they can see it and understand it through the software, but at least recognize that you're there, recognize that you're in the nose, and this is an incredibly dangerous place to be. Dragon Age Inquisition's original release date was Q3 of 2013, meaning that it actually shipped about a year later than it was originally supposed to. Here's the reality on that fact. This was coming from the executive. They were essentially putting constraints upon the project in order to try to get what they wanted, which was a game that would have been effectively a launch title for the Gen 4 consoles and would have cost a lot less money. You should know that in 2011 and 2012, Dragon Age 2 was a superstar project within certain circles of EA. It was a project that sold okay, was done really fast and really cheaply. So within the more finance-focused parts of EA, they loved this project. They loved the idea of maybe being able to replicate that with Dragon Age Inquisition. We never believed in that date. Aaron and myself were going in and agreeing to this date, knowing that we were going to have to come back later and ask for more time. But the problem is that we had to also basically scope and scale as if we were trying to hit that date. The original presented scale of Dragon Age Inquisition was a lot smaller than ultimately we ended up shipping. It didn't have playable races, which we definitely wanted to put back in after Dragon Age 2. Didn't have mounts, which we considered to be table stakes for a fantasy RPG at this time period. But ultimately, executives are the stakeholders that you need to get past to allow you to make the game at all. So we had to build a plan, a scope that allowed it to at least kind of look plausible, or at least plausible to an exec. It doesn't do great things to your relationship with your team that you are trying to execute to a plan of a game that both seems somewhat impossible to them and doesn't seem very good. And you're doing this because you're trying to work towards a plan for a date shift that you haven't yet been able to communicate to them, because you're trying to work through this in a way where you maintain some degree of operational secrecy and operational security. Not a great way for them to think either that you are trusting them or that you're even competent at your job. Was I lying? Yeah, that's exactly what I was doing. I was lying to get the project past its stakeholders, knowing that I was going to have to come back later and ask for more time. So executives are the stakeholders you need to get past. They aren't your final customer, but they're someone that can stop you from reaching that final customer. So Dragon Age Inquisition actually was developed under 3 different CEOs. The first CEO was John Riccatello. He's the one that said, you should put the ability to ride dragons into your game, which I nodded and said, we'll look into it, and ignored. Then he left, and we had a period of time where the CEO was Larry Probst, the chairman of the board, acting as temporary CEO. And then after that, the CEO became Andrew Wilson. Now, the interesting thing is the time period where we had to ask for that extra year started when John Riccatello was still CEO, but Aaron and I actually flew down to Redwood Shores to get this time. Between the time when we booked that trip and the time we got there, John was gone and Larry was acting as CEO. So we got to pitch to someone that we basically hadn't interacted with before. This is the meeting where we had to make that pitch and say, give us an extra year. We're going to put in playable races. We're going to put in Canary. We're going to put in mounts. We're going to make the game bigger. We're going to make the game better. This is the game that you want. If we try to hold to the existing date, here are all the compromises. Here's the game that you're going to end up with. You're not going to like it. This event was really interesting. Let me tell you pretty much the whole day in kind of a bit of a sketch form. At the time, back in 2012, there was a direct flight from Edmonton to San Francisco that left in the morning really early, and then you could take it, fly into San Francisco, do your meetings, go back to the airport and fly back and do a San Francisco trip as a day trip, which is exactly what we did. So you get to the airport at 4:30 in the morning to go through customs, then you fly to San Francisco, drive into Redwood City, and then we do this and we literally walk into the EA building with Larry Probst. It's 8:30 in the morning in California, and we're walking into the building in Redwood Shores at a time that is before a lot of people are actually at the office. Larry greets us and he's like, oh, you guys flew in last night? No. And we're like, nope, we flew in today. And he's like, oh, okay, well, that's pretty interesting, pretty impressive. We have our meeting. So it's us and Battlefield pitching at this meeting. Those are the two big games that are there. We have the meeting, we present it, and then we have lunch. At lunch, there is this spread of tenderloin and various meats and things. And Larry looks at this and he's like, do you guys eat like this all of the time? And one of the executives sitting in this meeting is like, yeah, we work hard and we get lunch in all the time because we're working so hard. And Larry's like, but I mean, this is an expensive lunch. You guys are bringing this in all of the time? And the executive, realizing that they've made a terrible mistake, tries to backpedal at this point and explain how, no, we're not wasting the company's money. Through all of this, Andrew Wilson is eating a salad he's brought to work. He was on a special diet, I think, and he had brought his own salad. So he is not participating in this spread of food. I have no proof of what I'm about to say, but I actually believe that this incident where people are jockeying for position with Larry to try to say, pick me, I should be the permanent CEO, and there is this lunch, which Larry finds wasteful and somewhat offensive, and Andrew Wilson is sitting there eating a salad he brought from home, went a long way towards Andrew Wilson becoming CEO of EA, because he was showing himself to be someone who was being responsible with EA's money. Is this true? I have no idea, but it certainly left a big impact on me. So we've done our meeting, this hilarious lunch has happened, and we then go and work a couple more hours out of Redwood Shores at the EA office, and then Aaron and I are leaving to go to the airport to fly back. And the flight leaves at, I think, 7:30, so we're leaving at 5:30, 5:45 from Redwood Shores. And through sheer coincidence, we are walking out of the building with Larry Probst again. And he sees us and he's like, oh, you guys are still here? And he's like, oh, well, yeah, we're going to the airport now and we're going to fly back. This is also pretty late in the day, so a lot of people have already gone home for the day. So what Larry sees from us through two accidental collisions is we were committed enough to the project to fly in, day of the meeting, work a whole day, as long or longer than some of the other people that actually lived in San Francisco, and then fly out on the same day to go back to work the next day. I can't help but think this had a big impact on us getting that extra time. Like Andrew bringing his own salad, I feel that this showed to Larry Probst that we were committed to this project. We were working hard and committed to squeezing every available second out of the time available to us. Is this how decisions should be made? No, but I do have a strong feeling that this is how this particular decision got made. Notice that it's Aaron and I that are going to Redwood Shores to argue that we need extra time, not Ray and Greg. Because at this point, when we're doing this, Ray and Greg have already departed EA. I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about what changed in a post-Ray and Greg world at BioWare. I talked about this a little bit in EA's consumption of studios. Ray, in particular, provided a lot of protection from teams, from the various politics voice of EA. This means that he would be the one that would be arguing for more time, or at least he would be involved in that argument. You would work through him for the most part and make the argument to him so that he could then make the argument up the chain. He had a lot more political capital than either Aaron or I did by a lot, so those arguments were different. In a post-Founders world, those arguments, those pressures were impacting me a lot more directly. Aaron wasn't nearly as an effective an umbrella as Ray was, nor was it possible for him to be so. And then as a result, as a side effect, more of these impacts of the organization as a whole were hitting the teams themselves than would have been in the past. Because Aaron isn't as effective of an umbrella as Ray was, and then I'm not as effective an umbrella either. So more of this stuff is getting down to the individual team member. But we're pretty deep into the development of Dragon Age Inquisition at this point. We're just in the working and getting it done. When people ask, how did things change? It was two things. One, a less effective armor between the executive of EA and the individual dev on a team. And then the second thing was that we had even less ability to hire and grow the team than we had beforehand. But to be frank, to be honest, Ray and Greg weren't particularly effective at getting additional budget either, so I think that's a pretty minor impact. I think day to day for most people, the change wasn't really super visible. I think it had an effect long term. I think it meant that the culture of BioWare in terms of being assimilated within EA accelerated. But I think day to day, second to second, it wasn't a huge, obvious change. Okay, so we've asked for more time, we've done our song and dance, and we've gotten it. One of the features that was part of this menu of additional features was mounts. Back in 2014, pretty much all of the early 2010s, mounts was pretty much a table stakes feature for fantasy RPGs. If you were making a fantasy RPG, you needed to have mounts or you were going to be looked at as if you were missing something. It's not that mounts are very widely used in most of these games, it's just that you kind of needed them to exist. We actually did a fairly deep prototype on mounts to see what the feature had from a potential perspective. There was a separate team that investigated having mounts for your entire party, making special areas where you would have mounted adventures, mounted combat, but like Todd Howard found with the implementation of Skyrim, you could very easily see how this was going to take over the development of the game because the areas needed to be designed in a very different way. They were either useless or way better than other options that you had for combat. So as a result, they would have become a very central tenet of the gameplay. And so we, earlier than actually happened with Skyrim, decided that this was a feature that needed to exist but needed to be deprioritized. I've talked about the letter grades of expected fidelity, and yeah, what we were doing here is we were intentionally making mounts a C feature. They needed to exist. They would actually be lower than players' potential expectations of the feature, but they would exist and serve the purpose of checking the checkbox of that table stakes existence. This is what I would say the mounted combat in Skyrim is like as well. Witcher does a little bit better, but they're still not putting it at the core of their game. So the lesson there is sometimes features need to exist, but don't need to be the best implementation of themselves. And in fact, the best implementation of themselves might be bad for the game overall, which was the decision that we made with mounts. Something that I think I'm probably the person who coined is the term multi-region open world, which is how we described the implementation of exploration in areas in Dragon Age Inquisition. This was in an effort to try to explain why the way that we built Dragon Age Inquisition was actually advantageous over a contiguous, no loads open world like you have in Skyrim or a lot of other open world games. I actually really believe in this, but at the beginning we were just coming up with terminology to try to explain this implementation to varying degrees of success, I would say. But for me, I actually think this is better, and let me see if I can explain why I think multi-region open world is superior in many cases to true contiguous open world. In multi-region open world, you're able to actually have your game take place over a much larger geographic area. Dragon Age Inquisition has stuff in Ferelden and Orlais, hundreds, thousands of miles apart. Even if you accept the sort of 10-to-1 compression of Skyrim is dozens of miles across. And in reality, it's way less than that. But if you integrate some sort of compression, it's a few dozen miles across. So Inquisition is able to have a grander scape of geography because of this multi-region open world. Additionally, because you're able to go to very different places, you're able to explore a wider variety of biomes and geology and have different creatures, have different cultures on display within your space without having what I called during Dragon Age Inquisition development the swampy mountain part, which is what you do see in contiguous open worlds, is you have to have a region where you move from one biome to another and it blends between the two. Skyrim does this purposefully in some cases. When you first approach Whiterun, you notice that it's surrounded by this band of farmland, and that band is basically empty of content. Well, not quite empty, but pretty empty of content. And Bethesda quite cleverly uses this band to take you out of the mental state of everything is out to get me, there's content all over the place, there's little designer hugs all over the place, and brings you down into something different to then have you transition into Whiterun and then have a different city experience, which sits apart from the exploration experience that you've just come out of. I don't know that they do that as blatantly with the other cities, but this first time they use it very effectively to set a different expectation of what you're going to see. But in the case of Dragon Age Inquisition or other multi-region open worlds, you kind of don't have to do that because you actually have the act of transitioning serving as that break in expectation. With Starfield, Bethesda's going to have the same advantage. You're going to have some form of interplanetary travel, which will serve as that break between what will effectively be a multi-region open world. Now, in the case of a game that has interplanetary travel, the metaphor is really working in your favor there. Whereas in the case of Dragon Age Inquisition, yeah, it meant you had load screens and it's not quite as elegant. But I still, for myself, think that it allows you to focus your game better, have areas that serve a purpose, and not simply have space that exists to be there or to serve as a transition between other bits of space. For people who are driven by exploration, they may not fully agree with this stance, but I think there's room in the marketplace for both styles of game. Now that we've gotten our time, we've figured out mounts, we're figuring out the multi-region open world, we are starting to get a game come together. And now it's time to start to show this thing. Going into PAX 2013, we still hadn't closed our outer loop of power about how you were going to control this story, this organization through gameplay mechanics. And a lot of what you see in the PAX demo is an effort by Mike and myself to kind of try to force the issue. So you have the burning of the boats, you have the capturing of the fortresses, trying to say to the development team, this will allow this entity, the Inquisition, to have a presence, to have an existence beyond simply being a name we say out loud. I've done a video dissecting that demo from PAX in quite fine detail. It wasn't successful, I would say. We didn't ultimately push the game in that direction, and I think probably that was for the best because, like mounts, you could see how this feature was starting to take over the game. In fact, even in the PAX demo, which is just a demo, you can see the hints of how controlling territory, controlling your army in opposition to Corypheus's army would start to be what the game was about. And it's not that you couldn't make a really great game which is about this kind of tactical, strategic, military operation. It's just that that wasn't the game that Inquisition was meant to be. So PAX includes some things that were ultimately inaccurate because at the time we still hadn't quite found the balance point between the Inquisition, the Inquisitor, the companions to figure out exactly what the game was going to be. Ultimately, the way that we found that balance was through the war table. So the war table is something that really does an excellent job of providing the illusion of scale. By working through the war table, which is essentially a very elaborate UI presentation, you are presenting the Inquisition as an entity. You are interacting with this. You are sending operatives out on operations. You are having your advisors tell you you are wrong or you are right and giving you advice, making the Inquisition feel like it is more than it ultimately was. Unfortunately, I think what we have is just a little short of what we would have ultimately wanted. The war table does a really good job of setting a baseline for the Inquisition. You are doing stuff very tactically when you go out on adventures on your own. We don't want a full-on strategy game. The one thing that I think is missing from the experience in Inquisition is the ability to play with Skyhold. I've often called Skyhold the toy we give you and don't let you play with. You get this stronghold. You customize this stronghold. There's a song that's sung when you find this stronghold, and then we never let you do anything with it. You don't get to take advantage of this toy that we've given you and see it in action. So the one thing I wish, in addition to the war table, in addition to requisitions, and in addition to the things you go out and do in the open world, what I wish that we had done is some mission or action or activity or something where Skyhold itself became a character for a plot or two, and you got a chance to take it out for a drive, so to speak. We can't really talk multi-region open world and PAX and the war table and Skyhold without spending a little bit of time talking about the Hinterlands. I've touched on this in other videos. I've talked about this in interviews. The Hinterlands is, for me, the perfect example of why where something is set affects expectations from that space. Before we get into it, can I just mention how much I love Harding? Harding actually came into Dragon Age Inquisition super late. What we found was that we needed something to introduce the different areas. Something from the Inquisition that would have a little conversation with you, and we tried just a generic scout, but it didn't give enough life to the spaces. So Harding was written to fill that need. And I love Harding. Harding's a great character in Inquisition. And I mean, who can fault the amazing Harding murdering a whole bunch of people and then turning around and being like, hiya, boss. What's the Hinterlands? The Hinterlands is an area that wraps around Redcliffe. So it's farmlands and it's settled, but not super settled. When I go to a city in a game, my expectations are most of the people in this space are props, essentially. They're there to make the city seem alive, and I'm not actually expecting most of them to interact with me, other than maybe to say, get out of my way, or bounce back when I bump into them. When I go into an unsettled area, like the Storm Coast, or the Hissing Wastes, or Adamant, or really most of the areas in Dragon Age Inquisition, I expect the density of people to be really low. And I probably expect that most of the people that I interact with there, I'm going to interact with because they're hostile or monsters or something like that. And if they aren't hostile or monsters, they're going to have a quest, and probably a pretty important quest, to give me. me. Same with areas that are war-torn, because in those cases, most of the people will have died or have fled, and the people that are left are either going to be immediately hostile or going to have something important for me to do right away. The Hinterlands is none of those things. It's something that falls in the middle. It is an area where I expect the density of people to be relatively high, but not so high that I expect the people to be props. I still expect them to be people that I can talk to, because if I see someone, they're probably by themselves or in a relatively small group, and there won't be anyone immediately around them, so they seem worthy of interaction with. But because the area is mostly farmland and in a relatively peaceful state, I also expect that the things they have to say to me, the quests they have to give to me, probably aren't going to be earth-shattering or epic, and as a result, my expectation is that I'm getting kind of beginner quests. And that's exactly what happens with the Hinterlands, is what you have is an area where the expectation of density is pretty high for people. The expectation for density of content is also really high. The expectation for epicness of quality is really low. But those three things combined don't really make a super exciting level, do they? And that's what we found with the Hinterlands, is the level to a large degree ended up getting populated as we went, as we were figuring out what open world content looked like. As most areas in Inquisition actually were, is we would build an area, you would put the things that had to be there, and then you would start to fill in the area until it felt about right. For something like the Hissing Wastes, once you put in the must-have quests, you didn't need a ton of other things to make the area feel right, because it was literally an unpopulated desert. Miles and miles of miles and miles felt about right. In something like the Hinterlands, you kept feeling the need to layer more and more content. And then what we end up with is an area that's basically a trap. Players get to the Hinterlands, there are hours and hours of content in the Hinterlands, and the game isn't doing an adequate job to tell you that you should probably go back to Haven and advance the plot. Lots of players, completionists, but not only completionists, feel the need to vacuum up all of this relatively mundane content. It sucks the urgency out of the game. It doesn't propel the story forward, which is why after launch, when we realized how big of an issue this ultimately was, we put in things to try to encourage people to leave the Hinterlands. But honestly, that ship had already sailed. It wasn't really possible to undo that. Lesson there is context determines content. And something like the Hinterlands has a context that encourages a large amount of low intensity content, which is probably not what you want as a player's essentially first experience of the primary central loop of their game. But sometimes you are going to have situations like this, situations where the content needs to be a certain way. And in these cases, what you need to remember is that ultimately you are a partner in setting the pacing of the game. Some players, their motivations are going to cause them to play in ways that will ultimately undermine their enjoyment of the game, especially in cases like the Hinterlands, where their motivations are encouraging them to play the game in a way that ultimately will be discouraging them to play further. We have the same thing in Mass Effect 2 with the planet scanning minigame. You have the ability to set pacing, and sometimes it is your responsibility as the game developer to dictate pacing, to prevent the player's own motivations from causing them to play the game in a way that is going to cause them to disengage. I talk about designer hugs. I mentioned them just now when I was talking about the Hinterlands. This is something that we kind of figured out as we were going. We're building levels, and people who were really familiar with Bethesda games were identifying that there was something wrong here, that it didn't feel right. And at first we couldn't really put our finger on what it was. One day I literally sat down with Kyle Scott, one of the producers, and we just sat there and played through a bunch of different parts of Skyrim and to see if we could figure out what was different, what was going on. And what you see in almost all of Skyrim is you are only ever about 45 seconds away from something, some piece of content. Sometimes that piece of content is just a plaque or a table with a person who's been stabbed into it and nothing more than that. But this is what we came to call designer hugs. Designer hug is something where a designer is going in and adding something that essentially says to the player, a human was here before you and cared about the fact that you spent the time to get here. And that's really what it was about, was having the game indicate to the player that they weren't just in procedurally generated nothing or level art that had never had a piece of content added to it. That they were somewhere where someone else had been there before them, and what they were doing right now mattered. And sometimes that content is a plot, sometimes it's a journal entry, sometimes it's just a funny vignette made out of some props from the existing prop database. But that was a lesson that we had to learn pretty late in development, that designer hugs are necessary to give the open world a feeling of care towards the player. Dragon Age 2 didn't have tactical camera at all. We had implemented tactical camera in Dragon Age Origins, but only on the PC. The console implementation actually discarded it for control, but also for performance reasons. And then on Dragon Age 2, for mainly the reasons of implementation speed, it got discarded. On Dragon Age Inquisition, we had to decide whether or not to bring it back. And ultimately, that was the decision that we had made. The implementation of the tactical camera in Dragon Age Inquisition is a bit of a compromise. It is still trapped on the walk mesh. It's not free floating like the one that exists in Dragon Age Origins. The reason why tactical camera was so difficult in Dragon Age Origins is partially because of that free floating nature. You need to build your areas under the assumption that you can see them from two wildly different directions. You need to make sure that as you slide the camera around, it's only showing you the things that it's supposed to show you and not parts of the level that you haven't revealed yet. And as a result, the level artists kind of hated implementing TacCam in Dragon Age Origins. They often quoted that it was twice as expensive as just doing the level in the first place. I question that number because it seems hard to believe that a new camera angle would completely double your effort, but I think it is fair to say that it is a significant amount of work to handle that free floating camera in that TacCam adds in Dragon Age Origins. The implementation in Dragon Age Inquisition reduces that cost by locking the camera to the walk mesh. It means that you kind of can't get the camera into places that it shouldn't be able to get. There's still some special work required to make sure that you're not seeing behind walls and things like that, but it simplified things by quite a bit. Of course, the consequence of that, the consequence of locking to the walk mesh like that, is it's a lot harder to use. You have to drive it around as if it's a little invisible guy in order to get it to where you want. The telemetry on the TacCam for Dragon Age Inquisition basically shows that very few people used it, and those people who did use it largely to pause, look around at the battlefield, decide what they're going to do, and then return to the over-the-shoulder camera and play the game in real time for the most part. Actually, if you watch my streams of Dragon Age Origins, that's pretty much how I'm using TacCam in Dragon Age Origins. I very rarely go into TacCam. I mostly do it to set up a few things and then largely play the game in real time. The fact that it's very expensive, plus the fact that it wasn't widely used, though you could argue that part of the reason why it's not widely used is because it's not the best possible implementation of it. Those two things together, to my mind, mean probably we aren't going to see TacCam going forward from the Dragon Age franchise. I mean, they could surprise me. My bet is that Dragon Age will continue cementing itself as an action RPG franchise and continue to move away from the old school CRPG things that mark its origin, so to speak, and that we probably won't see TacCam in Dragon Age 4. But I guess we'll see. Going into late 2013, we had what was called Operation Sledgehammer. This is where all the writers, plus Mike and myself, got together to try to scope the story into something that we could finish finish, but also make it all make cohesive sense. The truth of the matter is that for the most part, the stories in BioWare games are never really that amazing. The story in Mass Effect 2, the best rated BioWare game of all time, is gather a bunch of people together to fly through a mass relay and punch a baby Reaper in the face. But that's not what you remember of the game. What you remember of the game is the interaction with all those characters that you're gathering. And ultimately, I think you could say the same thing about Dragon Age Inquisition. The story of Dragon Age Inquisition is to stop Corypheus, but when you actually sit down and talk it through, Corypheus's plan is never communicated super clearly to the player. It seems like his plan is step 1, become a god. Step 2, do some other stuff. Step 3, something to do with reestablishing the Tevinter Imperium. I would say that for the most part, as a bit of plot advice, if step 1 is become a god on your 3-step plan, that maybe something's gone wrong in your communication of what's going on to the player. And often what you see with sort of become a god plots is they have an overarching plan, but what you're trying to stop is they become the god part. And so as a result, Corypheus does things throughout the story of Inquisition which makes sense from the perspective of re-establish the dominance of the Tevinter Imperium. The main one being Holem Shirel, where he is destabilizing Orlais, but they don't make a ton of sense from the perspective of become a god. So you're left with occasional moments throughout the story where you are doing things because the game told you to, and you know Corypheus is involved, but you're not really super clear as to why. So Operation Sledgehammer knocked the worst of that off the game, made the interstitials and the connective tissue make sense, made the game connect together and be achievable. And really, the lesson, again, is that the story has to make enough sense to hang your characters off of. Characters are what drive BioWare stories, not plot. Starting with Skyrim and going right up until probably 2016, and maybe even honestly still today, the gaming press, the players of RPGs were obsessed with numbers. BioWare was no better, and as a result, we fell into the trap of trying to be able to be bigger or more than our competition. So the reason why Inquisition has an area like the Hissing Wastes is because the Hissing Wastes is 16 square kilometers. And when you're trying to be bigger than Skyrim is about 40 square kilometers. So having an area the size of the Hissing Wastes goes a long way to being able to say that you're bigger than Skyrim. But size for size sake, numbers for numbers sake, do not a good game make. There are things that were said during the development of Inquisition. There were things that were done in the development of Dragon Age Inquisition in service of these numbers that ultimately didn't help make the game better very significantly. Another example is at one point we said that Dragon Age Inquisition would have 32 endings or 33 endings. And the reason we said that number was because Witcher had come out and said they were going to have a number that was one less than that number. And because of the way we were doing the ending slates in Inquisition, based upon the choice you had made throughout the game, we technically had 32 different endings because of the different ways those ending slates could play out. Is that what people think when they think how many endings do you have? No. But here's the thing I would say about endings. This is not a useful stat to base your buying decision upon, the number of endings that you have. So we were in a pissing contest with Witcher over something that didn't matter at all. I'm very strongly against most games sharing most of their numbers. I was even at this point in time in 2013 and early 2014. But the reality of the world that we lived in at the time was it was very difficult to interact with the public and the press without sharing some of these numbers. Like I said, I did a whole video about this. Size is not equal quality. Sharing your numbers is a very dangerous thing to do and often is misleading to the people that are consuming those numbers. Despite what I said earlier about us trying trying to do things the Frostbite way, trying to respect the engine, trying to do tools. Dragon Age Inquisition had a lot of features that you would think would be super core to the experience that came in super late. The core power loop came in after alpha. Something else that came in after alpha was save games, if you can believe it. So we were going through production and into alpha without the ability to make a save game in order to start the game at a different point. Now we had debug features that allow you to jump around, but that only lets you go so far from a testing perspective. I guess if the lesson here is don't wait to do save game until after alpha, duh. Inquisition actually slipped twice. We've already talked about the big slip, which was to cover the fact that we were never going to ship in 2013, but it actually slipped another 6 weeks. This slip happened in 2014 itself, and we were slipping for much more targeted reasons, to give the project time to fix some more bugs, to polish things up a little bit. But honestly, that slip also moved us into November, so we were hitting Christmas right on the nose. That slip happened as part of a product meeting that happened in Redwood Shores, where we were presenting to Andrew Wilson, and the slip happened as part of that discussion. I'm pretty sure Andrew actually still remembers that interaction between himself and me, because at one point in that meeting, he asked what you could do in the game, and then I fell into some sort of weird nerd fugue state until Patrick Soderlund kind of shook me awake so that I could stop wasting the time of the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. But I think it is helpful, and I've talked about the what do you do, how do you win question. That was the question that Andrew actually asked at that meeting. Something to keep in mind for your game is not everyone is going to immediately understand what the point of the game is, and being able to answer that question is actually quite a powerful thing to be able to do. Dragon Age Inquisition was always intended to be a multi-generational launch, meaning that it launched for the Xbox 360, the PS3, PC, but also the new generation of consoles, the PS4 and the Xbox One. A question that you could ask is, should we have done that? Part of the reason for that was because of Inquisition's original launch date, which would have put it a lot closer to the launch of this generation of consoles. But the other reason was simply that EA was really worried about uptake speed of the next generation of consoles. And looking at this generation as we're going into the PS5, we've seen it's taken a long time for PS5s to move into the market, mostly due to hardware scarcity, but still, the worry may have been justified. At the end of the day, the last generation versions, the PS3 and 360 versions of Inquisition, together sold about 1 million copies. That's not nothing. That's tens of millions of dollars of revenue. It might seem on the surface like this was the right decision to make, but I would argue that what you see from The Witcher, which had a very similar launch window to Dragon Age Inquisition, launched the next calendar year, but pretty early in the calendar year, is that they always intended to be just the current generation and not support the last generation. And as a result, they didn't have to make some of the compromises that Dragon Age Inquisition had to make. We made decisions pretty early on in order to make sure that this thing would actually turn on the last generation of hardware. And compromises were made. This compromised the design of the game in different ways. So if we hadn't had to do that, we could have made a game that was more tailored for the hardware that we were then targeting, and probably would have sold more on those new consoles. Does it make up the difference? I can't say for sure, because we're not The Witcher. I remain fairly convinced that it was a mistake to support the last generation of hardware. The sales there, while significant, are not enough to counteract the impact it had to the quality of the game. But unfortunately, this is also a decision that's relatively difficult to reverse late in the game. You can't just come along in 2014 and decide, actually, current gen consoles are selling well enough, we can drop Gen 3 now. It'll save you a little bit, but you can't just suddenly magically increase the density and fidelity of all the stuff that you were constraining into this Gen 3 box. It's not going to work that way. The only way you get to have that advantage of quality for dropping the earlier generation is by doing doing it relatively early in the process, at least in the middle part of production at the very latest. So a reasonable question to ask is, what was lost from Inquisition because of the support of last generation consoles? Now, it's a reasonable question, but it doesn't really have a great answer. I have a few things that I remember, but I'll circle back and talk about why that question is actually really difficult to actually answer. Some obvious ones: density of NPCs and creatures, especially in combat, was pushed down by support of the old generation consoles, because you can't have two sets of combats or two sets of levels based upon the performance criteria of the platform in question. I remember that maybe the lack of Canary helmets and the replacement with the tattoos was related to support of Gen 3, but I'm not sure if that's true. And then the other one is horses for the party. The primary reason that we ended up dropping that as a feature was because you couldn't have 4 horses loaded on the Gen 3 consoles. It just wasn't possible. But that brings me back around to why this question is actually harder to answer than it first seems. Because while that's the reason that we told ourselves that we cut horses for the party, is that really the reason why they needed to go? The levels aren't designed to have a giant 4-horse footprint of a party wandering through the levels, getting stuck on everything. If we had had the performance room to have 4 horses, there's a good chance that we would have ended up cutting the feature anyway in order to make it feel less terrible. So because Gen 3 was a feature that was mandated really early on in development, it infiltrates the thinking about everything. You end up discarding features really early in their conception, not even really considering them, because they seem like they would be hard to do or impossible on the older hardware. While there are some obvious things around density, a lot of other things that may or may not have been in Inquisition, it's hard to say for sure if they would have actually made it if Gen 3 was gone and there was a bit more breathing room on the performance side. Maybe I'm just going to rant about this one. I don't have a good segue into this or out of this, so we're just going to talk. The villain of Dragon Age Inquisition is Corypheus. Corypheus is introduced in a piece of DLC in Dragon Age 2, but we reintroduce Corypheus in Dragon Age Inquisition. Corypheus is the villain of Dragon Age Inquisition. You defeat Corypheus, you save the world, the credits roll, and then there's a post-credits sequence where something is revealed about Solus. And for some people, this undermines the entire game. They feel like the game, as a result of this post-credit sequence, is incomplete, and that we then tricked you into buying Trespasser in order to get the ending of the game. And this is just wrong. I mean, I guess you're entitled to your opinion, even if your opinion is wrong, but the game ends with you defeating Corypheus. The fact that things are revealed about Solus in a post-credits sequence, the fact that there is a piece of DLC that digs more into Solus, are additional and beyond the context of the story. There was a negative enough reaction from enough people within the community for Dragon Age to the post-credits sequence that my guess is that BioWare will never do a post-credit sequence ever again, because they are going to be very gun-shy based upon that reaction. And that's kind of too bad from my perspective. If you still don't agree with me, then I have a fix for you. The next time you sit down and you play through Inquisition and the credits start to roll, turn the game off and stop it right there. The experience isn't broken, and you don't need to learn anything about Solus, and there you go, problem solved. I guess engagement is engagement, so if you want to yell at me about this particular topic in the comments, go right ahead, and I can tell you that you're wrong a million different ways, and this will be the most viral video of my entire YouTube career. As long as we're talking Trespasser, let's talk about the DLC as a whole. There are 3 pieces of story DLC for Dragon Age Inquisition. There's Jaws of Hakon, there is The Descent, and there is Trespasser. And I say story DLC, Witcher used expansion pack to refer to this kind of DLC. I think that's a bit misleading, but we'll talk about that in a second. Those 3 pieces of DLC are in order. Another open world exploration area with some story, probably in a lot of ways the best open world area that we built. Secondly, The Descent is a cool dungeon romp where you go down and learn a little bit more about dwarves. And then finally is Trespasser, which is set in the future and gives you more information about what's going on with the Inquisition and with Solus. I think those are all decent pieces of DLC. They're priced appropriately for what you're getting, but I actually wonder if there wasn't a better opportunity in the case of Inquisition. Expansion packs in the old school meaning of the term would have been a large piece of content priced fairly expensively, say $45 or $50, potentially with a retail release that was then sold as a single unit, pushed with more marketing and used to essentially revitalize the title in the public consciousness. Expansion packs in that vein largely don't exist anymore, but when I step back and look at Jaws of Hakon, Descent, and Trespasser, squint my eyes and kind of imagine squishing those 3 pieces of content into a single unit and then making it all make sense as a single unit, it starts to make sense to me as an expansion pack. Something with a significant amount of content, with a $50 price tag, say, maybe with a retail presence, certainly with more marketing put behind it. The reason why I wonder about this, I imagine this sort of thing, is one of the problems that you have with story DLC is that it falls into attach rate hell, shall we say, where you are getting 8 to 15% of your players at most are buying this piece of DLC. Story DLC is not super cheap to make, and if you're doing something like Trespasser, it can actually get pretty expensive to make. So at the end of the day, their return on investment can be dilutive to the overall title. What I mean by that is that they can be profitable, but they can be less profitable than the original game, which was actually what happened with Trespasser. Trespasser cost enough money to make that it actually reduced the profitability of the overall title from a percentage perspective, not from a magnitude perspective. When you look at expansion packs, at least as they used to exist, they tend to have much higher attach rates. Awakening from Dragon Age Origins has an attach rate of around 35%. Which is a lot better than 20% and certainly a lot better than 8%. And at that point, it starts to invert that situation where the profitability starts to become expanded by your DLC or your expansion pack. And I wonder if there wasn't an opportunity to do that in Inquisition. As I said, expansion packs have largely disappeared from the world of AAA gaming, at least expansion packs in that very high price point. Destiny, I guess, has done this. Hey, did you know that Dragon Age Inquisition actually had a multiplayer mode? Based upon the telemetry, I would say the answer for most of you is actually no. But it's true. Like Mass Effect 3, Dragon Age Inquisition has a separate mode where you can play multiplayer raid-style missions, and actually it's pretty fun. Dragon Age Multiplayer, or DAMP, because the Dragon Age team loves its acronyms, came into being mainly actually because of the efforts on Mass Effect 3. There are 2 major things that that team felt that the multiplayer mode gave them. The first was that it gave them the ability to test and improve and iterate on their combat much more quickly and bring their combat to a much higher level of fidelity because they had this multiplayer mode driving things forward and allowing the combat to get better quicker. And the second is that Mass Effect 3 multiplayer actually made pretty good money. In fact, it's still actually making money, continues to have people who play it relatively regularly. But there are also 2 negatives that we're seeing with Mass Effect 3 multiplayer. The first was that it was perceived as being mandatory by a lot of people who played Mass Effect 3. It was a way to generate readiness, and when the game shipped, It was basically impossible to get enough readiness to get the quote-unquote good ending without having played some of the multiplayer. That wasn't intentional, it was a bug, but that's how it shipped. So the impression was that you had to play it, and the game pushed you pretty hard to play it. And the second thing that was seen as a negative in Mass Effect multiplayer was that the cap of spending was relatively low. For about $300, which I realize is still quite a bit of money, you could get the best of everything in the game. You could have a maxed out weapon for every possible class that you were going to play in Mass Effect multiplayer. Dragon Age multiplayer was trying to get these benefits and address these criticisms. So how did it do? Well, in short, not so great. First of all, it didn't help Dragon Age's combat very much for two reasons. The first reason is that Mass Effect combat and Dragon Age combat in terms of team mechanics are actually surprisingly different from each other. In Mass Effect single player, you are essentially requesting your teammates to do things. You're not really in direct control of their behavior. And as a result of that, the balance of the game is such that Shepard is just better than everyone else. His abilities do more damage, and you are always the hero of the combat. In Dragon Age, that's not actually the case. Everyone is balanced the same. You have much more direct control of your party. But this means that the multiplayer mode in Dragon Age doesn't look as much like the single player mode as the two modes do in Mass Effect, because it has to be balanced again and rejiggered with the assumption that you're only ever controlling one single person. So abilities are changed, especially abilities that rely on your ability to pause the game and target really carefully. It's not really a thing you can do in multiplayer because you can't pause. You can't spend the time to target that ability really carefully. Balance levels are changed. And as a result, the lessons that you're learning, the changes that you're making for DAMP aren't actually necessarily particularly applicable to the single player version of the game, where you have 4 people that you can take direct control of and give orders to. The other issue is that multiplayer, especially multiplayer combat, wasn't given the level of attention that happened on Mass Effect 3. In the case of Mass Effect, what happened is that multiplayer sort of took on a life of its own and took over the driver's seat for the design of combat as a whole. This never happened on Dragon Age Inquisition for similar reasons to what we just talked about. It is different, and people could see that it was different, but also we were doing a lot of new things. It was a new engine. We were trying to get exploration back into the franchise. We were trying to get tactics back into the franchise as well. All of these things drew attention away from multiplayer combat, and in the case of tactical combat, arguably was in direct opposition to that goal. So it never really gained that position of prominence that happened on Mass Effect. Secondly, because of the backlash against Mass Effect multiplayer is forced upon me as a player, we overcorrected on Dragon Age Inquisition and essentially hid the mode away. It's available on the main menu, but the game never mentions it or pushes you towards it really at all. So as a result, the percentage of people that even turned it on is actually really low. What I would have expected if we hadn't hidden it quite so successfully is that we would have had a significantly higher percentage of people at least trying it. Would way more people have played it? It's hard to say for sure, but I would expect to see a much higher percentage of people at least having played a single mission to see what it was like. And then finally, how did it do financially? As I mentioned, Mass Effect had this problem where if you spent about $300, you pretty much bought everything. So the progression in Dragon Age multiplayer was designed to have essentially no cap. I believe you could essentially max it out for something like $30,000 or $40,000. But the problem with the progression in Dragon Age is it's complicated and kind of confusing, and it's very easy to get something that the player can perceive as a good enough item. So what happens is, instead of people spending more money in order to chase The best item in Damp is they actually end up spending significantly less money because they very easily and very quickly can get something that seems like it's good enough and then not see a clear progression to something that would be better and then just stop spending. Mass Effect's progression in multiplayer is very simple. You upgrade a weapon from level 1 to level 10 and then you get a new weapon, same thing. So it's got a very clear progression and path, and it's very clear that you have a level 8 and there are 2 levels of better over and top of that. Dragon Age's progression is much less clear, and as a result, people are very quick to set the progression aside and just satisfy themselves with whatever they have and stop engaging in the economy at all. So overall, Dragon Age multiplayer didn't really accomplish any of its goals. It didn't really make very much money. It didn't help the combat in single player. But even still, we had this, and so we decided that we were going to try to make a standalone free-to-play version of Dragon Age multiplayer. This had the code name of Hendrix, following the naming convention that we were using for code names at the time, and it was basically trying to be something that would introduce you to Dragon Age as a property and be an on-ramp for the game. EA wasn't very supportive of this product at all because they just saw it as a potential cost center, and so it was only available for download for a very short period of time. It got no marketing, and it essentially kind of faded into the ether. But briefly, in 2015, there was a free-to-play version of Dragon Age Inquisition available for download. EA has tried various things to try to get people to subscribe to Origin, their subscription service, and to give them money on a monthly basis. EA's data shows that, on average, someone who buys EA games buys less than 2 games from them a year. It makes sense for them to try to pivot to a subscription service where they're getting a consistent revenue stream from people, and they've tried a lot of different things in order to try to encourage that. One of the things that they did and do is giving early access to the game for people who have the subscription service. I do not like this as an incentive, but you can certainly see why it would be attractive for something like a sports title. I get the game a week early, get to figure out how the game works, which means that for the first week that the game is out in the world, I know more than other people, and I am able to have an advantage in the multiplayer experience. But for Dragon Age Inquisition, it did not help. It hurts, because what it essentially means is that your launch day is 7 days early, but for a much smaller group of people. And you are having to deal with a launch and then deal with another launch 7 days later. It allows the sentiment on your title to begin to solidify while you're not even really selling that many copies of the game. You saw this dramatically with Mass Effect Andromeda, where a version of the game came out with some fidelity bugs, and it was out in the world for a week without a lot of control over the narrative. Sentiment on the game solidified very quickly and very negatively. I believe that EA is backing away from this for story-driven titles. I do not like early access in general, and certainly Inquisition solidified my opinion on that topic. In some ways, the box for Dragon Age Inquisition is very like the box for Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2. It has a strong use of negative space. It has a fairly strong graphical look, but in some other more obvious ways, it is a big departure. It moves from the red and white aesthetic of the first 2 games and goes to green and darker blacks and grays. And there's some good reasons and some bad reasons for this. The good reason is to make the box look more like the game. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think there's something to be said for having your color palette of your marketing campaign be consistent with the game itself. You can see this with Dreadwolf. They are trying to do the same thing again, is bring some consistency to the game and the UI and the marketing assets. I think there's something to be said for that, a consistency of look. But that being said, I do think that moving from that strong red and white to the black and green, you lose a certain distinctiveness on the box art. For me, Dragon Age is always going to be red and white, but I get the idea, I get the thinking behind unifying the look. Dragon Age Inquisition is probably one of the last collector's editions that BioWare's ever going to do. As we move into more and more of a digital world, collector's editions become more and more anachronistic because you're not really buying a collector's edition, you're buying a box of stuff that goes alongside your game. Maybe the game doesn't even come with it. And I believe Inquisition was maybe one of the first games that actually did that, which allowed you to buy a collector's edition without the game, then acquire the game however you wanted, whether physically or digitally, and then have the stuff without necessarily having to have a copy of the game in there as well. Inquisition approaches the collector's edition very differently than most games. So collector's editions are all about getting your perceived value up above the difference in price. So you have a remote control car. It doesn't really matter what it cost you to make. What you do is you say, okay, well, people are going to perceive this remote control car as being worth about $50. And also there's a hat that's worth $2 and some stickers that's worth $1. And you add all the stuff up and try to get the value above what you are going to charge for the thing. Usually collector's editions are anchored on a single big high value thing, a statue, a remote control car, a drone, something like that, where most of the value is coming from a single item, and then you pad it out with other things, stickers and posters and digital goods to get you the rest of the way. In the case of Inquisition, we went a different way. We went with a whole bunch of little things that each had a fairly large perceived value and together added up to being worth more than the delta in the collector's edition. I really like the stuff that's in the collector's edition for Inquisition. It's got a cool map, it's got lockpicks, it's got things that you would put on a map as place markers, but I think it's missing that big marketing hit of having a single big giant dragon statue or a bust of Varric or something. Would I do a collector's edition in the future? I think I would. I think that they still remain a bit of a signal of how big you are. Because if you're big enough to get a collector's edition, you must be a big deal. And for some of your potential buyers, being a big deal is what's going to push them over the edge into actually buying your game. It can be valuable to have these signaling factors that show that we're a big deal, we're worth paying attention to. Collector's editions ultimately don't really make very much money, and often they're kind of run to be break even, but I think they can help sell more copies of the main game, even if they don't make money on their own. Dragon Age Inquisition shipped in 2014, and it's Game of the Year of 2014. It won the most Game of the Years from all of the outlets, but there's something interesting about 2014. 2014 ended up being a really tough year for games. A lot of games that were supposed to come out in 2014, like Witcher 3, ended up slipping into 2015. 2014 was where a lot of the games that were supposed to be launch titles for that generation of consoles slipped into, but then maybe didn't quite completely get their act together and didn't end up being super clean and crisp when they finally came out. So you actually notice something interesting in 2014. If you go to something like GameAwards.net, which keeps track of who got the most awards in a given year and how many awards they got and who the runners-up were. When you look at 2014, what you actually notice is, compared to 2013 and 2015, a lot less game awards were given out in general. There's just a lower count for all of the games. Inquisition is in first by a substantial margin, but it has substantially less Game of the Year awards than Witcher 3 does coming in 2015. So 2014 was a tough year for games coming out. As I mentioned, Witcher 3 was originally supposed to come out in 2014. In fact, CD Projekt and BioWare were playing this weird game of chicken where our release dates were the same, and then Witcher moved, then we moved that last 6 weeks, and then they moved into 2015. While I've talked about, there being a bit of a pissing contest between the two projects in the past, I don't think the release dates ultimately were being in competition with each other. It's possible, but I don't believe so. That being said, a question that can be asked is, how much did Witcher change based upon the reception of Dragon Age Inquisition? And I don't know the answer to that, but there is enough time between the November 2014 release date of Dragon Age Inquisition and the May 2015 release date of Witcher for them to have integrated things they learned from Dragon Age Inquisition. I would be very surprised if there wasn't some impact from them having played our game and responding to it. And of course, that's what you should do, is if you have the time, you should look at things that are having a big impact in the industry and adjust and alter as required. You have to be careful because it's very easy to fall into last game-itis and just copy whatever the last thing was, and then something new comes along and you're pivoting all the time. But in the case of Witcher and Dragon Age Inquisition, the two games are certainly very similar in a lot of ways. There were lessons there for Witcher to learn around low-quality fetch quests and the way that plots are distributed. Something small that I could definitely see Witcher having decided to do based upon playing Inquisition would be the way they track quests. Witcher tracks one quest at a time, and as a result, your navigation is very clean. You can end up actually walking right past another quest that you might have because of the way the tracking works. But what it does is it actually increases the impact of their quests. It's a bit annoying for people who want to vacuum clean the levels, but it overall improves the impact of each individual quest by making it be the most important thing that you're doing right now. Did they decide to do that based upon playing Dragon Age Inquisition? I have no idea, but I do think that that is something that is a small but notable difference between the two games that makes a difference in the perceived quality of the quests. Okay, I did this for Dragon Age 2, and I will do it again for Anthem, but why don't we just talk about things I would change with a time machine for Dragon Age Inquisition? I have some broad things, but ultimately Dragon Age Inquisition is a game that I'm really proud of. For a game that I led, it's the closest to the game that we were trying to make. But I think there are a couple of things that you can imagine. Certainly, I would make the game fairly significantly smaller. You could cut the hissing waste for sure. You could cut one of the three different areas that were built out of the original Dales level for sure. You could cut at least one other level without impacting the quality of the game whatsoever. The amount of power required to progress the critical path should and could be tuned down fairly significantly. That's something that I would actually even argue that could be done in a remaster to improve the flow of the game. If I have enough time, I would be tempted to not make the Hinterlands the first open world part of the game you get to, but I'm not entirely sure how you go about doing that. If not that, then at least integrating some more stronger push to get the player out of that level and into some other levels more quickly to progress the story and get the game moving. Going even broader, something that you can imagine is going way back into the genesis of Inquisition and saying, well, let's change something that would be very difficult to change. Let's make Dragon Age Inquisition built upon Unreal. I'm not convinced that this actually makes Inquisition a better game, but it is certainly possible for me to imagine a world where an Inquisition built upon Unreal and ideally built upon Mass Effect 3 allows for a smoother Andromeda development and potentially a smoother Anthem development. Because if Inquisition is on Unreal, then the argument would of course be Andromeda should be on Unreal and Anthem should be on Unreal. And maybe if you have a time machine and you're going back in time and somehow managing to make Inquisition be on Unreal, you can also strong arm the other projects that follow it into being significantly more convergent than they were. We have a time machine, so we're in total fantasy land. Maybe squint really hard and bonk my head up a few times and imagine a world where an Inquisition on Unreal, while not necessarily making Inquisition a better game, allows Andromeda and Anthem to have a firmer foundation to build upon. Would it have happened? I don't know. This is the fantasy part of the video. So with that, we are done with Dragon Age Inquisition. We probably have two more of these left. We will probably do Anthem, Mass Effect Andromeda, and Joplin together as a single video, and then we will finish this series up with a video about Morrison. If you found this interesting and you've made it all the way to the end, we are over 90 minutes at this point. Thank you for sticking with me. Consider subscribing so you don't miss it when I finally manage to get to Anthem. And a very special thanks to my members because they provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member, you will get early access to videos when they are ready. There's a link to that below this video. We also have merch. If you're interested in picking up a shirt or something like that, there is a shelf below this video as well. So for me, Inquisition is the Dragon Age that I am most proud of. It is the Dragon Age that sold the best. It is the Dragon Age that got the most awards. What's your favorite Dragon Age game? Let me know that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.